I think last night Rob was mentioning that we would kick off this panel, and he referred to us as sort of the elder statesmen of the Washington Institute. The two of us prefer to refer to ourselves as the grizzled veterans of the Washington Institute. We collaborated on this study, and the purpose was to try to outline what would be not just the main challenges that the Obama administration would face in its second term, but also to try to encapsulate how you should respond to them. And I think one of the things that's striking about it is the two of us have a lot of years of experience working in this region and beyond this region, and also how this region connects to the broader international system. And I think it's fair to say that in all the different administrations that we served in, we faced crises. In fact, one of the things I can tell you without any qualification, in every administration you're confronted with a crisis you don't expect. That's just almost a given. But what I can also tell you is there has been no period in the Middle East, in my experience, in any of the administrations I worked in, where the challenges were significant, but none of them compared to what this administration faces in a second term. Literally, any one of these issues would be enough by itself. If we were talking only about Iran, it could take up all the bandwidth, to use the current vernacular. It could take up all the bandwidth of this administration's time. Or Syria, as we look at it today. And if you look at the front page of the New York Times, you see an extraordinary story just on refugees in one camp in Jordan and what it means, and its implications, by the way, for that generation, but also what's happening in Jordan. Syria by itself could assume and absorb all the attention. Egypt and the broader Arab awakening by itself could absorb all the attention. In the past, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and if you look at the current activity of the Secretary of State, could absorb all the attention. But this administration has to deal with all of these. It has to find a way to deal with all of them. It has to find a way to carve out its approach in terms of priorities, the management of its resources, how it's going to allocate the work of the administration as it deals with it. And it has to make some judgments about what it can do, when it can do it, how it can do it, and what are the best ways to do it. And the two of us understood that this is what the administration was going to face, and so we wrote this with that in mind. There's an overview to it that is an effort to try to create that context on the one hand, but also to make the point that in a very real sense you have problems here, some of which at best you can only manage, some of which you're trying to affect and change its direction and trajectory, some of which you may actually try to see if you can transform, all of which are trying to somehow affect the landscape of the region. One thing I think you can fairly say is if this administration were to succeed in fundamentally affecting the Iranian nuclear program and or fundamentally affecting what's going to happen in Syria, the impact on the region would be, I think, quite significant, and particularly among our friends in the region. I can say to you, again, without qualification, that our traditional friends in the Gulf have not gotten over the Arab awakening, the removal of Mubarak. I mean, one of the striking things when I was within the administration is that whether I was dealing with the leaders in Saudi Arabia or within the UAE or the Israelis, it was as if they had one script. Whenever I would be talking to them, or whenever I would be preparing them for a phone call with the president or the vice president, they would say to me not just the same arguments, they would use the same words. There is a perception that we have not yet overcome, which is that somehow we threw Mubarak under the bus. Now, there's a lot of things you can say about what we did or we didn't do vis-a-vis Egypt, but when there are 2 million people in the street and the Egyptian military wasn't prepared to save Mubarak, it wasn't up to the United States to preserve Mubarak in his position. But we are still dealing with a legacy there. And there is a perception right now in different parts of this region that American power is waning, and if we could affect somehow what happens with the Iranian nuclear program in a way that makes it clear that either we have succeeded in ending it through diplomatic means or we have acted militarily to make clear and to act on what the President has said his objective is, which is prevention, or if we could be somehow reshaping the landscape in Syria, this would go a long way to reestablishing in the eyes of some of these key friends the efficacy of American power. But that's a lot easier to say than to do. And we didn't make an effort in this to deal with every single issue within the region. We chose to deal with those that we regarded as being the most significant and that would have an effect on the rest of the region, which is, again, how you approach policymaking. So having set that as the context, I'm going to offer a set of observations on a number of the issues, and then Jim will chime in on some of the others, and there'll be some areas where we talk about the same issue but from somewhat different vantage points, and then you can ask us questions. And it's true, the study is available outside. It's also, if you go out to the corner, there are some people hawking it. And there's a few people as well, you know, where there are some cutouts of Obama in front of the White House. There's a few people passing it out there also. But that's just part of the new marketing technique of the Institute. All right, so let me start with the Iranian issue, which many of you have heard me say this before. In the first term of the Obama administration, there was no single issue that commanded more of the president's time than this issue. And the administration succeeded in creating a process, and it succeeded in creating really unprecedented pressure on the Iranian regime from an economic standpoint. You heard General Allen talk last night about the kind of security architecture. He played, by the way, a major role in the creation of that security architecture. And you also heard him talk about the need for a more effective strategic communication with Iran. What I would like to say to you is the following. Point one, the good news is we have put a lot of pressure on the Iranians. And from an economic standpoint, there's no question that they're feeling it, and there's no question that there is dissonance within the Iranian elite in no small part because of the economic pressure. Now, I just exhausted the good news. Now the bad news. The bad news is that their nuclear program is proceeding apace. And the reality is that at some point things are going to come to a head given the president's objective of prevention and given the fact that their nuclear program is proceeding, including after 10 years of trying to introduce the next generation of centrifuges, they've now done it. They apparently have overcome the technological problems they had with the next generation of centrifuges. And these centrifuges are 3 to 5 times as efficient, as productive as their first generation. If you do the math, that means that they're going to be able to accumulate low-enriched uranium at a pace that's 3 to 5 times faster than was the case before. That's one aspect of the program. Another aspect of the program that doesn't receive attention is that by the end of 2014, they will have completed work on a heavy water plant, which means the Iranians are positioning themselves to be able to go nuclear in one of two ways, either through enriched uranium and building a bomb on that way, or through plutonium and the reprocessing of it. So there are two different avenues that they could be pursuing, and apparently they are pursuing. And the United States, within roughly a year's time frame, depending upon who's describing it, is going to find that we will no longer have or be in a position where we could have a high degree of confidence that we could detect their ability to break out quickly and act fast enough to prevent it. What I'm saying, in effect, is there could come a point within about a year's time, or less, where the Iranians could present the world with a fait accompli and declare they actually have a nuclear weapons capability. And if our objective is prevention, we would have to act prior to that time. So that's one of the reasons we are likely to see things come to a head unless the Iranians themselves take unilateral steps and slow down the character of the program. So the first point to bear in mind is that we are coming to a head one way or the other, probably within about a year's time, unless the Iranians make a decision to slow down the pace of their program, which they could do. You know, they have, if you look at the logic of how they've tried to shape this program, where they see certain thresholds that they believe would trigger an American response or maybe an Israeli military response, they're careful to avoid that, all the while continuing with their program to put themselves in a position where they would have the option at a time of their choosing to go nuclear, and I mean to go with a nuclear weapons capability. So within a year's time frame, something has to give. If we want diplomacy to succeed, the economic pressure is simply not sufficient. Maybe for a different leadership it would be, but not for this leadership, specifically not for the Supreme Leader. If we want diplomacy to work, we're in the paradoxical situation that we have to convince the Supreme Leader that we are prepared to use military force. It isn't enough for us to say all options are on the table, because at this point, he doesn't buy it. He doesn't believe it. That's why General Allen last night was talking about a different kind of strategic communication to convince them that that's the case. There are some things that we could do in that regard. We could move away from the kind of step-by-step approach we produced in negotiations, which simply tells the Iranians that their rope-a-dope strategy actually is working. I mean, the longer you stay with step-by-step, the longer you convey a message that's exactly the opposite of what we are saying when we say the time for diplomacy is going to run out. Well, when you're pursuing a step-by-step approach, the message you're sending is, no, there's plenty of time. And that's the way they behaved. So you have to, if on the diplomatic level, you have to clarify what you're prepared to do, which is you have to move to an endgame kind of proposal that in effect says to them, look, we're prepared to accept you having civil nuclear power. Here's the definition of it. Here's how it's going to be constrained so you can't break out. And if they can accept that, that's one thing. If they can't, then you know you're on a different track. That's one thing you can do to begin to signal them, look, there really is a limit here. A second thing you can do is start working with others on the day after scenarios where, you say diplomacy has failed and you're prepared to use force, but diplomacy is still going to be required after you use force. Because there's no military solution to this problem. You can't destroy their know-how and their engineering capability. If we were to go to the Russians and Chinese and say, we haven't given up on diplomacy, but let's start talking about the day after, I can assure you that within a microsecond, the Russians would be in Tehran saying, hey, look, these crazy Americans are now talking about what we should do after they use force. A third thing we could do, there's a variety of things we could do, but a third thing we could do, and this is a kind of seamless segue to the Syria issue, is act differently in Syria. The hesitancy that we show in Syria demonstrates to them that we're really not prepared to use force. If you have a red line in Syria, you better act on it, because if you don't act on the red line that you've established in Syria, the message is going to be, well, there's no red line you're going to act on at all. All your red lines are actually pink lines. So Syria actually creates an opportunity, and it's a strange way to talk about Syria. Use Syria and opportunity in the same sentence is kind of an oxymoron these days, but it does create an opportunity to affect the Iranian behavior. And one of the reasons I think we have to do that is because, again, I want to get back to what I think is a fundamental paradox. I actually believe, and I've said this, many of you have heard me say this, and I'm quoted by people outside the Washington Institute to this effect, having been in the midst of the debate when the president made the decision to pursue prevention as opposed to containment as an objective, I know he thought this through. I know he heard all the arguments. I know he has a high degree of confidence in his own judgment, and I know he made a decision for prevention. So my view, without any qualification, is if diplomacy fails, this president will actually use force. But we're in a paradoxical situation where That's becoming more likely because the Iranians don't believe it. So if you want diplomacy to succeed, you've got to change the Iranian perception, because right now their misperception of Hind makes the use of force more likely. Syria is one way to do it. I don't want to overextend my welcome up here, and that's easy to do, and I understand that Richard does have a little lever over there, and the platform opens up here, and I disappear if I speak too long. But I want to say about Syria that there really are no good options. This is in 1995, before we acted in Bosnia, then Secretary of State Christopher described Bosnia as the problem from hell. And I can assure you that, by comparison, Bosnia looks simple when you look at Syria today. We can get into how we got to this point and whether we should have been more active earlier. That was my position even when I was in the administration. Suffice it to say, the options today are all bad, and no one can stand up here and say to you with a high degree of assurance that there's one option they can present and they can tell you things are going to work out. You have an opposition that is fragmented. You have it, at this point, the balance of power favors the Islamists. The sectarian divide, given the bloodletting and the sheer devastation, has become nearly unbridgeable. The effort right now to produce a political process with the Russians has only one possibility, and that's if the Russians are actually prepared to disassociate from Assad. Ironically, my own view is the more they think that we're about to cross a threshold in Syria, including doing things that we weren't prepared to do before, the more that's likely also to affect the Russians. But the only possibility of a political process there that has any chance of changing the situation is if the Russians are prepared to change their behavior fundamentally. And at this point, I'll believe it when I see it. So the president right now, having established a red line, in my mind has no choice but to act on the red line. But that's different than choosing an option that he thinks can actually transform the landscape within Syria. Since there is no option that guarantees that, you have to be prepared to run a risk. But you also have to look at Syria today from the following standpoint. It presents us with a moral imperative because the sheer humanitarian catastrophe is almost impossible to comprehend. This is a country of 21 million people. The latest figures now suggest that 4 million people are displaced internally, the vast majority of whom are living in desperate conditions. There are 1.4 million registered refugees on the outside. I said registered refugees. That understates the actual number. The UN's stated figure of dead is 70,000. That figure is almost certainly above 80,000. When you do the math, it's almost incomprehensible what is happening. It means almost no one in Syria is untouched by this. And from just the sheer humanitarian dimensions of this, that should impel greater action on the part of the international community. But there's also a strategic dimension. I testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then I wrote an article about this, where I said in the American foreign policy tradition, there are two schools of thought. One is an idealist school of thought, one is a realist school of thought. The idealist school of thought thinks America should only intervene in places around the world when there is a moral imperative, when there's a humanitarian issue at stake. So in Rwanda, we should have acted to prevent genocide. It was good we acted in the Balkans, but we were late acting in the Balkans. It was good we acted in Libya. Maybe we should have done more. The idealists say it's only when we act on the basis of our values that we should intervene. The realists say, no, never intervene on that basis, because that sets you on emotional binges. And you end up costing yourself so much that you can't intervene in the places where you should intervene. So the only places you ought to intervene is where you have an unmistakable national security interest and imperative. Now, Syria is the one place where both exist, because there's a moral imperative because of humanitarian catastrophe, but there's also a national security imperative because, as I like to say, the Las Vegas rules don't apply to Syria. What takes place in Syria ain't going to stay in Syria, and it already isn't staying in Syria. Jim knows this better than anybody, and he'll talk about Iraq, but Syria is making Iraq dramatically worse. It's making it very difficult to avoid a rekindling of the sectarian conflict there. And I'm not going to get into that because he will, but it has an effect on Iraq. It has an effect on Lebanon. I believe, by the way, there's a very high probability that we may yet see a rekindling of the sectarian conflict in Lebanon because of what's happening in Syria. Jordan right now has absorbed 500,000 refugees. It has a population of about 6 million. It's absorbed 500,000 refugees, 200,000 since the beginning of this year. It can't continue to absorb it without potentially destabilizing Jordan. Jordan is critical to Israel. Jordan is critical to the Gulf states. And I haven't even talked about chemical weapons. And if Syria becomes basically a failed state where al-Qaeda is able to embed itself, and they get control of the chemical weapons, you think it's just going to threaten its neighbors? So we're not only talking about the destabilization of all the countries around Syria, you're talking about what can be a threat to us, a very clear threat to us. So Syria creates basically one of those few cases where both the idealists and the realists come together to do something. The president has established a red line. He hasn't yet acted on it. I do believe he will. I think the time that's being taken right now is not a reason to avoid action. I think he's trying to figure out, in a difficult circumstance, what's the right thing to do. My own preference, I'll tell you what it is, and then I'll tell you what I think the fallback should be. My own preference is that I would like to see us do a no-fly zone. I'm not convinced that it is as costly as our military believes, but I can't dismiss that. If we don't do that, I would like to see us provide lethal assistance, but I don't want us to do it in basically a half-hearted way, because it won't have any effect if it's done in a half-hearted way. If we're going to do lethal assistance, then it means not only do we cross the threshold, but it means deciding that we're going to do it in a way where we seize the moment, we seize control of this. The president gets agreement from all the key participants in this coalition, which include the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, the Qataris, Turkey, Jordan, Israel, the British, the French, and maybe others. You create what is a clearinghouse. You make it clear there's going to be one address for all weapons. We are going to identify this. We will probably have to put CIA people, not troops on the ground, but CIA people on the ground, much the way we did in Afghanistan early in the conflict, to make sure that the weapons are going to where we intend, to make sure that those who make commitments to us about how they're going to use the weapons actually do it that way. This is a huge investment in terms of arms, money, training, attention. One senior person within the administration has got to be responsible for managing this every day, going to the president when it's necessary. This will be a huge undertaking. It doesn't require American troops going in there, but it means it takes up, and when I talk about bandwidth, an awful lot of time and attention of the administration. If we are not prepared to do it, this is the only way, it seems to me, to try to change the balance of power, not only in the conflict, but to change the balance of power within the opposition itself. So we don't want the Islamists to emerge dominant within Syria. If we are not prepared to do that, then we need to fall back to a containment strategy, which by itself won't be so easy. It means investing with our allies in buffers in Syria, because you have a fragmentation already, localized leaderships, localized groups, investing in them in the southern part of Syria, in the northern part of Syria, maybe in the Kurdish part of Syria, to contain this conflict, which is not a great option. But the one thing we have to understand is we cannot afford to be in a situation where this destabilizes the whole region. So if we're not prepared to do something more to actually affect the landscape and change the landscape within Syria, then at least we have to contain it so that it doesn't spiral out of control and become a threat to our basic interests. All right, I was going to go through more of what's in our study, but you could see that could take up the whole conference. So I'm going to stop here. We can, in the Q&A, we can get into Egypt and the Israeli-Palestinian issue and the other issues of the Arab awakening, but I want to turn it over to Jim because he'll talk about Iraq, Turkey, and how it fits also with these other issues.
Thank you. As you can imagine, it's not easy to follow Dennis Ross. I got my introduction to high-level Middle East politics by the side of Dennis back 18 years ago at the Amman Economic Summit, which, like all Middle Eastern events, at some point towards the end collapses totally in a Perils of Pauline drama queen moment, and some American has to go fix it. Well, that American was Dennis, with me tagging along, and the Arab in this case was the still foreign minister of Qatar, the famous HBJ. And we sat, the three of us together, and for an hour in unaccented, perfect English, he harangued America for everything we had done in the Middle East all wrong since 1945. And at the end of this thing, when he ran out of breath finally, Dennis basically said, gee, that's interesting. Now, do you want to fix this problem? And the problem got fixed. Some of the problems I'll talk about are not going to get fixed just as quickly as that did, or as easily. What I'd like to do is touch on a couple of issues and then go back to the strategic where Dennis started, and we'll open up to questions. First of all, Iraq. Iraq remains, if not in the headlines, critical to everything we do in the Middle East simply because of its location, the size of its population, their basic significant degree of education and capabilities, and the fact that, to quote the International Energy Agency, Iraq will provide, if things go well, 45% of all new crude oil in the world in the coming decade. If things don't go well, we're out 45% of new crude, and you can imagine what that's going to do to oil prices. So Iraq, not just for oil, but for many other reasons, simply getting our forces back and forth around the broader Middle East. We need Iraq's airspace. It goes on and on and on. Believe it or not, Iraq is a relative success of American diplomacy and military might under both the Bush and Obama administrations. Would have been better if we could have kept troops, but we have a good relationship with both the Iraqi government and most of the opposition parties, and the country, up until very recently, was at relative peace, and the constitutional system, even though most of the actors would like to toss it overboard and seize control, still becomes the game, still remains the rules of the game that all of these actors play in. They themselves may not be democratic, but they're forced to adhere to a democratic constitutional system, and there are various outside actors that pressure them to do that. And frankly, the fact that one of the parties to the dispute, the Kurds, have their own army and options actually helps the constitutional system. So Iraq was doing fairly well, and then what happened? Syria. Syria, at one level at least, is a sectarian or potentially sectarian conflict between Shia and Sunni Muslims for the future of the Middle East. I won't go into the theology, but just like in Europe in the early modern era, people can be converted or forced to convert very easily between the various brands of Islam, just like they could between the various brands of Christianity at that time. And this creates tremendous threats to identity, and those threats to identity in turn create tremendous temptation to do violence to those who think differently than you or pray differently. So we really, really are facing a crisis potentially in Iraq because of the impact on Syria, because of the impact Syria has on Iraq, and with each of the different groups, the Kurds, the Sunni Arabs, and the Shia Arabs. This requires a lot of American attention, both in Iraq, which I'll touch on in a second, but most importantly, by doing something, as Dennis said, about Syria. What should we do then in Iraq? Again, fix Syria, hard as that is. But meantime, we have to ensure that the Iraqis know that we will continue to fight against al-Qaeda. We have counterterrorism and other programs in Iraq. They need to be reinforced, and there's some positive signs about that. Secondly, Prime Minister Maliki has shown disturbing tendencies towards authoritarianism. This isn't a surprise to those of us who know him, but it's gotten worse under the pressure of Syria and under the pressure of opposition to him. This requires strong words from Washington and by others, including the Turks, that we won't tolerate that. On the other hand, we're willing to work with him if he continues to maintain a constitutional basis for his rule. That has to be the sine qua non of everything we do with this guy. The third thing, and here there has been some progress of late, is to find a solution to the dispute between Kurdistan and Baghdad. On the surface, over hydrocarbons, who controls what kind of production of oil and gas, export and such. The Turks play a big role in that. And the U.S. government, has been able in the last few months to coordinate policies better between Ankara, Erbil, Baghdad, and Washington. And we've seen some progress, including a recent agreement between the Kurds and Maliki to move forward on these issues. This requires constant U.S. attention. When it is present, which it was up until the fall, things move forward. When it disappeared for a while, things went down the drain. Now they're coming back up. That's the lesson, not just in Iraq. Turkey. Turkey is an interesting case. For a long time, when we talked about the Middle East, including at the Washington Institute, we really didn't think too much about Turkey. But Turkey is, despite being a NATO partner and an EU candidate, Turkey is a Middle Eastern power. Aside from the U.S.-Israeli relationship, there's no other relationship we have in the Middle East, or the Turks have in the region, that is so reasonably balanced between degrees of power that both sides bring to the table. The Turks are major players. They also overestimate constantly their impact, the role of their soft power. We are the biggest soft power country in the world, and we know how much that gets us in many disputes. So the Turks, with far less soft power, really can't trade that for a whole hell of a lot, I don't think. But it is out there. What do they want? First of all, they want a stronger American policy towards Syria, as Dennis described, and that's absolutely necessary. That will be what Prime Minister Erdogan this week or next week in Washington will raise with President Obama. Secondly, they want a coordinated policy on Iraq that gives them both access to the hydrocarbons of the entire country and a stable southeastern border. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the Turks are engaged in a region-wide competition with Iran. In and of itself, that's not a bad thing. It's one reason why we got the NATO radar focused on Iranian missiles deployed to Turkey. But if we don't play a huge role in the region in general, and with Iran in particular, the Turks are liable to engage in what will amount to a Sunni-Shia struggle for supremacy in the region, and that's bad news, just as we saw in the Balkans. That conflict degenerating into a Muslim Orthodox Christian Götterdämmerung. We have to be very, very careful in dealing with the Turks that we don't go in that direction. On Iran, a couple of points to follow up with what Dennis said. The nuclear issue is the most important specific issue with Iran. But it isn't a question of if you fix the nuclear issue, you're going to fix the problem of Iran any more than reaching SALT I with the Soviet Union fixed the problem of communism and the threat to our world emanating from Moscow. Iran is a long-term threat to the region. There is a difference in my mind as somebody who's worked on North Korea. As seemingly crazy as that government, particularly at present, is, their ability to seize world headlines notwithstanding, North Korea, even if it did seek a hegemonial position in Northeast Asia, doesn't have the power. It's by far the weakest state. It's surrounded by China, second largest economy in the world, Japan, third largest, us, the largest, Russia, UN, Security Council, permanent member state, and nuclear power. It doesn't have the ability to really project power. Iran, alas, is very different. It's in the middle of a region where no other country, with the exception of Turkey, can begin to meet its power even without having nuclear weapons. And secondly, it's in the middle of a region that is extremely and almost inherently unstable. Therefore, we have to deal with Iran not only today and tomorrow, but over the long term, just as we dealt with the Soviet Union. A couple of general points to close out before we get to the questions. First of all, let's be clear about this. This region remains crucially important to American interests and to world peace. There's been a lot of talk about the pivot. There's been a lot of talk about American energy independence. Please, and we've talked about this with some of you yesterday, I would advise you, forget it. With or without American energy independence, the world will remain dependent upon hydrocarbons out of the Middle East. And as long as we're the world's 911 and reserve currency country, to some degree reserve energy country, we have to ensure that our friends and allies also have access to energy, and that means the Middle East. It's the center of Eurasia. It's a major weapons of mass destruction and non-proliferation challenge, and it is a source of most terrorism in the world today. It also is where some of our key allies, beginning with Israel, on to Turkey and to the Gulf states, reside, and our ability to defend our interests anywhere, and I'm being specific here about East Asia, begins with our ability to stand up to our commitments, to our red lines, to our allies in the Gulf and throughout the region. If we fail in the Middle East, we cannot succeed in East Asia, period. We defended Europe in 1950 by going into Korea. It's the same analogy. So, again, thank you for your interest in this region. We're all committed to it. We've been doing this for much of our lives, and it requires a great deal of public interest. The issues that we're dealing with here are very, very hard. Now that I'm a retired government official working for the Washington Institute and writing things, it's easy for me to take pins on a map and pretend they're aircraft carriers, or think in my mind of bombs falling on some of my favorite enemies, or blistering demarches delivered to a very long list of people I'd love to see our government deliver blistering demarches to. But it's not that easy when you're in government. This is really hard work. But these people are paid, as we were paid, to do hard work. It can be done. It was done in 1990 when we put 500,000 troops in the desert. It was done in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It can be and must be done when our national interests, our existential security, and the international order's interests are at stake. In the Middle East today, they're all at stake. Thank you.
All right, I'll take questions. I've got one to start with. I'm not sure the exact number, but I believe it was something in the area of 25% of Americans, when polled, think that we should do something in Syria. So do we have to move the opinion of the American public along before we do something? And if we do, how do you do that?
Excellent question. And I want to answer it by saying there is a context right now, domestically, which makes it difficult to do some of the things that the two of us were talking about. I want to give you an example of where the mood is. The beginning of April, I took part in a retreat that was held in Istanbul for 30 members of Congress, off the record. And I was asked to talk about Iran and the Arab-Israeli issue, but I obviously, part of the discussion was also on Syria. These 30 members of Congress, who covered the whole spectrum, Democrat, Republican, and at a certain level, I have to say, it was kind of reassuring because the character of their discussions didn't reflect anything that we normally think about the way Congress works these days. They actually got along well. They asked really thoughtful questions. There was a kind of genuine curiosity. But the thing that was unbelievably striking was there was no one among the 30 who thought we should do anything more in Syria. Not one. The same group was prepared to support the president acting militarily against Iran. But no one, not one, was prepared to do anything in Syria. Now, does that mean that we say, okay, because they're not ready and because only 25% of the American public are ready? You know, at the end of the day, presidents have responsibilities. And presidents have to make what are tough decisions, and sometimes the president has to move public opinion and not be led by public opinion. Now, I'll grant, as I said, I don't know whether the administration, given everything that it's confronting, given the fact, and my own perception, by the way, is one of the reasons for the president's hesitancy on Syria has been that when he went to the JCS and asked for options on Syria, they came back and said, we can do these things, but not if you still want to be in a position where you can do something on Iran. And I suspect, I can't say this, I don't know it, but I suspect one of the reasons for his hesitancy is not just the fear of being sucked into a quagmire when the country isn't ready for it, but I think he wants to preserve his ability to act against Iran, and he's worried that if we get drawn more into Syria, that this could affect that. What I'm saying is, you want to resolve Iran peacefully, then you have to do more in Syria to convince them, you know what, when we establish certain thresholds, we mean what we say. And that applies to you. So, Syria doesn't require sending American troops in. But it does require a different level of activity, and it requires the president to explain it, what we're doing and why we're doing it, what's at stake. It's not difficult to go ahead and outline why we have big stakes, and then explain then the character of what we're doing, the logic of what we're doing, what the objective is. One of the things, and this is not limited to this administration, I don't think there was a single administration I was a part of, and I'd be interested in Jim's reaction as well, where I felt that we did as good a job as we should have in explaining to the public what we're doing and why we're doing it. I remember I was with Baker when we went around the world and we put together an international coalition, you were referring to it in 1990, to basically create the basis to go to war and expel Iraq from Kuwait. But I still remember when I was with Baker and he went out in a press conference and he was asked the question about why are we doing what we're doing, and this is before we went to war, why are we doing what we're doing in the Gulf? And he gave 3 words, jobs, jobs, jobs. And as soon as he walked off stage, I looked at him and said, are you kidding? And he said, maybe that wasn't the best way to frame it. We have got to do a better job of explaining what our objectives are and why we're doing it. I mean, part of what we can do here is not just to do the analysis, but to explain the stakes. But administrations, as I said, it's not unique to this, need also to realize that it isn't enough to carry out a policy. You have to be able to sustain a policy. And if you don't explain it in a way that the American public will get, then you're going to find that it's difficult.
One quick comment. First of all, I do agree with Dennis, and here's a concrete example. Pew survey, January 2012. Should we take tough action against Iran on the nuclear count? 50% of Americans, yes. 40% no, avoid conflict. 10% spread, not good. In the fall of 2012, 8-9 months later, Pew did another survey. Now the take action is from 50 to 56. The don't is from 40 to 35. Now we have a 20-point spread, much more likely to get American support, at least a few months ago. What happened? The political campaign forced both the president and Governor Romney to speak out on the issue of the Iranian threat. We had Bibi Netanyahu at the UN General Assembly. It was something that Americans started thinking about and talking about. The result is a perceptible shift towards America taking action because leaders spoke about this and tried to explain it under the pressure of our democratic system. It can work if we support it.
We've been talking about these issues in one form or another for many years. I think all of us have a general understanding of them. What you didn't mention was that other allies also have vested interests, and what are they doing? Israel has already demonstrated that they have red lines that are not going to be crossed, certainly in Syria, with who knows what else is coming there, and who knows if and when something will happen in Iran with Israel. What effect does that have on what the United States will do?
Well, let's take Syria to start with. I'm tempted to quote Henny Youngman and say, now let's take Syria, please. If you don't have a sense of humor, you shouldn't come. That was always my motto in diplomacy.
Did you tell the president that joke one day?
I don't think he would have laughed if I had said that. But just let's look at Syria. The Saudis, the Qataris have been acting on their own. They have provided a fair amount of arms, fair amount of money, in a way that is not governed by thinking about what happened in Syria, other than, at least in the case of the Saudis, let's just have Iran lose. Let's bleed Iran. Now, I understand their logic, but if the net effect is you're not thinking about the day after in Syria, and the net effect is you're going to destabilize the whole area around it because you end up basically financing Al-Qaeda or radical Islamists within Syria, it ends up being self-defeating even to their interests. So there are, in answer to your question, other countries are acting. The question is, are they acting in a way that makes sense? The British and the French have moved to try to get the EU to lift the embargo on providing arms, which by the end of this month will probably happen. So they're also acting, but what you need is coherence. What you need is an unmistakable objective and then moving in the direction of that objective. The Israeli action on vis-a-vis Syria again, needs to be understood for what it is. The Israelis established a red line that has nothing to do with the balance of power within Syria. In fact, though there are some in the Israeli hierarchy who are very anxious to see Assad lead, there are others who are not. Not because they have any brook for Assad, but because they're fearful about what comes after Assad. So their action is exclusively a red line that they established, which says you transfer qualitatively new weapons to Hezbollah out of Syria, and we will prevent that. If you try to do that, we will prevent that. Now, what the Israelis have demonstrated, by the way, is that with standoff systems, you can actually do quite a bit. Meaning the Israelis are not penetrating Syrian airspace. They're using what are standoff air-to-ground capabilities, air-to-ground missiles, to take out those particular targets. The Israelis have a very discrete set of targets that they go after. Now, that's not necessarily the same for us. We can draw lessons from this, meaning you can use standoff systems, but then you have to be focused on discrete kinds of targets as well. But what it does demonstrate is one other thing. Other countries are acting right now. But is there one coherent objective that is driving the action? And the answer is no. So we have an interest in trying to create coherence out of what are all these disparate kinds of actions. If we didn't have a big stake ourselves, that would be one thing. But we do have a big stake, and that's why I think we have to move in a direction of trying to create greater coherence.
Marty?
At our Scholar Statesman dinner, you and Elliot Abrams were asked whether in 2013 someone will attack Iran. You both said yes, rather promptly. One, do you still feel as confident in that answer today as you did then? And similarly, if you imagine ourselves at our next Soref and described what happened in the past year, what decisions do you actually think will be coming out of this administration?
Let me start with that one first. I think we will respond on the red line. I do. I don't think, this president has said, and the vice president, one of the lines that I can't tell you how many times he used to say this, and I know we both heard it more than once. Vice President Biden says, as a rule of thumb, big nations can't bluff. And the president has said, I don't bluff. And that's why I say he will respond. At some point, we will respond on the red line. So I think we will respond on the red line. Now the question is, will the response be a one-off, or will it be tied to a bigger objective? A one-off, by the way, in my mind, might actually be a military action, meaning we could identify which units were the ones that used the chemical weapons. I believe, by the way, that they used aircraft to deliver these, and I think they also used artillery. And so you can probably identify which units were responsible for using it. A one-off action would be to say, we said red line, and you act in a one-off action to do two things: to prove that you mean what you say and there's a price to be paid, and a way of establishing a deterrent that will do more if you breach it again. A different kind of response would be something that is much more geared towards trying to affect the realities within Syria along the lines that I was suggesting. I don't know what the administration is going to decide to do, but what I do think is that we will have acted to respond on the red line. As for the first question, I don't feel quite as confident as I did when I gave that answer, not because I have any doubts that the president, if diplomacy fails, will act, but I think the time frame could be a little longer than this year. I say that in part because it's pretty clear the Israelis are talking about a somewhat longer time frame now, and I think we're talking about a somewhat longer time frame now. But when I mean that, I would be surprised if something decisive hasn't happened before next Soref. So I would say that as well. Now, what decisive could mean is there's a diplomatic outcome, which, I don't find to be implausible or impossible, but it won't happen unless we change the circumstance and convince the Supreme Leader that we're prepared to use force, which today he doesn't believe. And it could happen because they decide to slow down, which, again, that's within their power to do. Or it could happen because the Israelis decide at a certain point that though they may think we're serious, they're worried about whether or not we will actually, in the end, act in a timely fashion even for us, which could lead the Israelis to act. I don't think the Israelis want to, but I think anybody who thinks just because the temperature seems to be down. And it is down. It's down after Bibi, after the president and Bibi met, came out and said, I'm confident that the president's determined to prevent. He hadn't said that before, which says to me that in their meeting, one of two things were said. The president probably went farther in terms of defining the point at which he fears that the prevention could be lost and he would act without saying a particular time frame, but giving a set of broad criteria. Or he sent a message, alternatively, which was that if we don't act by a certain point and you've given us time to pursue the diplomacy and you act, we're going to be there for you. He could have said one of those two things. My sense is he must have said one of those two things for Bibi to have changed the kind of public posture that he had had previously.
Thanks. Question to Dennis. In your list of those things that we could be doing to convince or persuade the Iranians of our military commitment in the event diplomacy doesn't work, you didn't include military presence or visibility. Couldn't we be doing more to show the strength and commitment of military by improving the visibility of our presence there and commitment to the military option?
I'm not persuaded necessarily that's it, because we have a big presence there. I mean, one of our problems is, because of sequestration, we took a carrier out. So that sends the wrong kind of message, obviously. But, General Allen referred last night to strategic communications. Now, part of that is what we say, and he was being quite diplomatic, I thought. I say that as a diplomat. He was being quite diplomatic. What he meant was, our biggest problem has been that there were mixed messages that came out of the administration. And if you're sending, the essence of coercive diplomacy, the key to coercive diplomacy, you want coercive diplomacy to work, you have to convince the other side that threats you make are threats you'll act on. And if they become convinced of that, then the prospect of actually having diplomacy work becomes much greater. The president's messages himself have been clear, but you've had different members of the administration, certainly in the first term, say things that completely contradicted it. If the message, Gates and Mullen at different points said the worst thing that could happen would be the use of force, be a catastrophe. Well, if you say using force would be a catastrophe, well, you're telling the other side that's the last thing you're going to do. So that, I think, probably counts for more. One of the things he didn't say is that we have run lots of exercises. He was responsible for building up our presence in that area. And he was responsible for orchestrating a whole set of exercises. We run exercises out there all the time. We've run exercises to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. Multi-nation exercises. Those are very visible, I assure you. We've done all sorts of other exercises out there. The fact is, there's some things we've done that the Iranians don't even tend to pick up, that when we've tried to do things militarily, we want them to pay attention to, and they don't seem to get it. Did you hear you heard what he said last night about what he's done what he was doing in Afghanistan, and things we were doing in Afghanistan, but they seemed to perceive them in exactly the opposite way that they were intended. So he was conveying that the use of forces doesn't necessarily always convey the message that you want. Now, there's some things that I didn't mention I would have us do. We have something called the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, which is a 30,000-pound bomb, which penetrates deep underground before the fuse itself ignites. That's why it's effective. Now, it was only created, it's a conventional weapon, right? I can assure you that there aren't many other targets around the world that it would be intended for. I mean, talk about a system that has Iran, this is for you, pal, on it. I mean, this is basically it, because, Fordo, which is this facility built inside a mountain near Qom, this is why you build this kind of weapon. We don't have a lot of other places in the world. Now, I've seen demonstrations of it, and one suggestion I made was we should just put it on YouTube, because I assure you, this will go viral, they will see it, and they'll know, one of the things he said last night, he wants us to sort of convey to them, hey, look, we have the military options available, which we do. I mean, he was responsible for putting them together, which we do. And we have a very high level of confidence that they will work. And oh, by the way, you see this thing here? Good luck dealing with this, pal. So, I mean, there are things we can do that don't require exercises, which they don't seem to pay as much attention to as we might believe, and other things where they may pay much more attention to than we think they ought to, which tends to be much more in the area of these kinds of communications.
How much more time do we have? Another 3 hours. Let's try to let's do 3 questions at once. Let's do 1, 2, 3.
Is this on? There's a report that the Russians are thinking of selling the S-300 anti-aircraft systems to Syria, and the Syrians have already paid $900 million towards those purchases. How does that play into the mix? Does that force the hand of this administration become more actively involved, or is that a game changer? Does it make it much more complicated to intervene?
Dennis, you were at the center of power, and you believe the president will use force against Iran. But you indicated what the impending tragedy could be. The Iranians do not yet believe it. I link part of that to what you said at the beginning, the perception that American power is waning in the region. To me and others, it's more than a perception. You added that the president must move public opinion. And that's a large part of my concern, of our concern. The president has views as to international legality. As a lawyer, I've pondered what would be the legal pretext, the legal formulation. He's assured us he's not the cowboy. Unless that case is built, that there's a legal basis in his view, which is credible, for the use of force, I just intend to worry more about this, that the Iranians will be convinced that he really intends to use our power.
Why don't we want to do that, and then we'll go back.
I saw the S-300 report. First of all, the Russians had sold S-300s to Syria because, in fact, we blocked them from selling them to Iran, so they went there. I believe there are some already in country. Whether this is a new sale or whether it's a continuation of the sale, we need to look into this. The facts are still a bit sketchy. If it's a new sale, it's quite problematic because I think what the Russians have committed to was that they would carry out their ongoing weapons sales that they'd already signed contracts for. But if this is a new contract, then it indicates that we have a new problem with Russia, particularly coming right on the heels of Secretary Kerry's talks with Lavrov. So we need to look at that. In the end, in terms of the military effects of that, by the time the equipment gets to Syria, by the time people are trained up on it, if we're still debating whether we're going to go in or not, by that time, believe me, we're not going in. So the military effects of that are, if true, are limited. The political significance of that in terms of how we're doing with the Russians could be quite dramatic depending upon what the facts are.
On the question of the legal basis, there'd be a variety of different ones that we could use. The simplest would be Article 51 of the UN, which provides for self-defense. This could be, in the case of self-defense for one of the neighbors, assisting them, or I guess you're talking about Iran. So, I mean, it would be self-defense in our case because of what we see as the crossing of the nuclear weapons threshold and what that means. There are, again, we're very unlikely to be able to get a resolution out of the Security Council because the Russians and or Chinese would block it, so you're not likely to be able to do that. But, you know, when we did, in the 1990s, when we did Bosnia, and then we did Kosovo, we didn't have a UN backing. We didn't have a UN Security Council resolution. And we went in with NATO. And, you know, the justification here could be not only Article 51, but the fact is that there have been 6 Security Council resolutions that they are violating today. So I think that we can create a legal justification. I think what you want to create is a political justification. And the political justification, I think, can be created by our demonstrating unmistakably that they had a chance to solve this and they didn't, according to what they themselves said they want. They say they only want civil nuclear power. That's why I say the diplomacy that's been pursued, which is step by step, has run its course. And that was never going to provide a justification for us because it doesn't present to them what would be the opportunity to have civil nuclear power. I am convinced that before the president would use force, that we will have a significant political, diplomatic offer that will be put on the table, which, if they accept it, gives you a pathway out. And it has to be credible enough that the rest of the world will see they really had a chance to resolve this. And it really has to expose them for having the chance to get what they say they want and turning it down. You'd present this to them in private, and if they turn it down, then you go public with it as a way of demonstrating they had a chance to solve this politically, diplomatically, and they deliberately chose not to because they want nuclear weapons.
If we go into Syria, or if anyone goes into Syria, who do we help? Who are the good guys? And what do we expect if we go in there? What kind of result do we expect?
Well, again, let's be clear on what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about sending American forces in there. I'm talking about providing assistance, lethal assistance, not non-lethal assistance, to those that are prepared to make commitments to us that, A, they're committed to a non-sectarian, inclusive future for Syria. Yes, they do exist. The problem is they don't have arms and they don't have money. There is a Supreme Military Council now. General Idris is someone that we're prepared to work with. I'm not suggesting that, again, we don't test this. I'm not saying you immediately provide all the arms to them that they ask for. You calibrate it. You see if they do what they say they're going to do. You see if they create accountability. You see if they live up to their commitments. But I think it does require, look, we had a lot of people in Afghanistan before we sent troops in there. And I'm not talking about sending troops in, but we had CIA operatives on the ground working with the Northern Alliance, working with some others. We're vetting those in Syria that we're giving non-lethal assistance to. We're vetting them. And if they cross the threshold of credibility, we give them non-lethal assistance. You do the same thing. We've been in this now. This has been going on for over 2 years. When I was still in the administration, and it had been going for 9 months, and we would have these interagency meetings, and people would come in and say, well, we don't know who the good guys are. I said, we spend how much a year on intelligence? Why aren't we finding out? Look, we have people at the Washington Institute, Andrew Tabler, Jeff White, David Pollack, who's here, who have been able to identify who the right people are. We had a young guy from the Revolutionary Council of Homs come and visit us at the Institute, who's since gone back. Young guy, he says to us, if Bashar Assad falls and the Islamists take over, we lost the revolution. He said, and we're trying to organize ourselves, and we're doing it. We have one problem. We don't have money. We don't have communication equipment. We hear the administration is giving it to people, but we don't see it. And we're still doing it anyway, because we're not going to act or try to coordinate or shape our own future because of you. We have our own destiny we're trying to shape. But I've said this to the administration, senior people in the administration, if people at the Washington Institute can identify who the good guys are, why can't you? And in fact, I actually brought, because Andrew and Jeff had developed a list, I brought the list with me. And trust me, I talked to really senior people. I said, here, check it yourself. They did. No, I think we are doing more. The fact is we are doing more now, but I'm convinced we will do more. The question is, will we do as much as I'm suggesting? I don't know.
Over here. Wait for the mic. Wait for the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. Iran has obviously deemed Syria a strategic asset and is putting a lot of resources into keeping the Assad regime. If the regime were to fall, my question is how that would affect the nuclear issue. The regime falls, do they entrench, dig in, or does it weaken them to the extent that it actually improves the chances that a diplomatic solution could be found? And so I know this is difficult to know their thought process, but my question is, I guess a two-part question, if it does improve the chances of a diplomatic solution, wouldn't it be in our strategic interest to ensure Assad falls and thus reduce the chances of a much more catastrophic conflict with Iran down the road?
It's a really good question, and it's one that I racked my own brain about. Here's my view on it. Whether it makes Iran more intransigent or more willing to negotiate, in my personal view, having observed Iran over the years, is anything makes this particular Iranian leader more intransigent, regardless of what it is. But maybe I can be proven wrong sooner or later. But the point is, again, going back to our talk, the difference between Iran and North Korea is Iran has a real effort underway and a real drive to become the hegemonic power of the region. And their definition of the region is very broad. As I tell people, marathon, it isn't just a race, it's a battle fought in the Mediterranean between Greeks and Persians. Those are the Iranians. So therefore, their hegemonial drive requires, first of all, playing a role as a leader of the rejectionists against Israel, including with a military option. That's Hezbollah. That's off and on Hamas. That was Syria, potentially, on the Golan. And if you take that away from them, if you isolate Hezbollah, and if, however Syria comes out, you no longer have a powerful, modern, Russian-equipped force of 300,000 or 400,000 troops facing Israel's northern front, you've changed the strategic equation in the region, and you've put Iran not back to the Gulf, but you've put it in a very, very difficult position. My feeling is let's put it in that difficult position and then see if it makes them more or less intransigent.
You talked about the United States strategic interests in seeing Lebanon not destabilized in Iraq. What are Russia and China's strategic interests, and also vis-a-vis Syria? I mean, do the Russians want to see Syria stay on the boil and everything unstable because it's going to hurt us? Or at some point, where's their pucker? Do they have a pucker point here? And the Chinese as well, obviously. They're a little different because they're a net buyer of crude and the Russians are a net exporter. Thank you.
First, I think that the Chinese are a derivative of the Russians on this issue. And the reason is the two of them have a deal when it comes to the UN that they always stick together in the Security Council, particularly when you're dealing with anything that relates to resolutions that could affect the domestic makeup of countries. Each wants the UN staying out of the domestic business of countries because they don't want it visiting them. So the Chinese are completely derivative here. It's interesting. Oftentimes the Chinese embassy here asks me to come and talk to them, and they'll always ask me, what do I think should be done in Syria? And I say, I think you should change your behavior to start with. And they're saying, well, tell us what we need to do. And it's always as if they're saying, look, it's really not us. It's the Russian. So the one to focus on are the Russians. Now, why is Putin the way he is on this issue? I think there's several factors. One, they actually have their only continuing naval presence is in Tartus within Syria. They've had this long-standing relationship with the regime, and they have, they want to. If they thought, let's put it this way, if they thought that Assad was on his last legs, I suspect their behavior would be different than it's been. They have read the balance of power somewhat differently, and they've also sought to send this kind of message that we stand by our friends, regardless. And they also, they want to show they matter. I say it a lot that, to understand Putin is a guy who said that one of the worst tragedies of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this wasn't one of even the worst tragedies for the Russians. But in his mind, it was because it was a loss of stature. And they want to matter. And look, they position themselves in Syria by doing what they're doing. Everybody looks to them. So one of the reasons they don't change is because they still see themselves having leverage. I have said on a number of occasions, you want to affect Putin, you better show him the costs. If we could get the Arabs to come together, since they seem to care about this so much, and say to the Russians, we're going to boycott you. Say it privately. And say, you got a choice. You can be friends with Bashar or friends with us, but you can't have both. And if you're going to stick with where you are, then there'll be no meetings with Russian officials. We're not going to talk to you about economic issues. Create a boycott. You don't even have to declare it to begin with. Now, the Arabs, as a rule, tend not to take strong actions of this sort. So they haven't done this. They tell us they do these things, but they don't, because if the Russians really thought that they were going to pay a price, they would begin to change their behavior. The key here is for them to understand either they're going to pay a price or they're going to be made to look irrelevant. Secretary Kerry went there, and they produced this initiative. We'll see whether the Russians are actually prepared to dissociate from Assad. But what I would do is I would have said to the Russians the following: we're prepared to work with you. We're prepared to help manage what comes after. We don't have a problem with you maintaining a relationship with the new Syrian regime government that emerges. But understand one thing, that if you don't make a move with us now, here are things we're going to do in terms of crossing thresholds, and we're going to make you look irrelevant. This is your choice. You can be relevant, or you can be made to look irrelevant. You want to affect their behavior, that's what it takes.
I would like to ask this of Dennis. Perhaps you can explain why sanctions were lifted on 11 countries by the administration when effectively it was doing an outstanding job, and it was also lifted in the central bank, which was prevalent in preventing Iran from doing a substantial amount of international trade. And it's just hard for me to understand. I was an advisor for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and the committee chairman certainly didn't understand it. Letters were written to the administration without any response. Perhaps you can shed some light on it.
Well, I'm not quite sure what you're talking about. I'm not aware of any sanctions having been listed on the central bank. What you may be talking about are the exemptions that have been created for those countries. We created an approach that was one in which if your central bank is doing business with the Iranian central bank, then you can't do business with our central bank. Now, we gave exemptions to countries if those countries were reducing their purchase of Iranian oil. And if they met a certain standard of reducing their purchase of Iranian oil, then we went ahead and we gave them exemptions to this. Well, I think the reason is because we want them to continue to be part of a larger coalition, and if you didn't do that, we felt that they might not be. I mean, these are countries, some of these countries include South Korea, Japan, China obviously is one, but I think Turkey is another, right? So there's a number of countries that if they continue to go along and purchase less and less of Iranian oil, I think the administration has felt that meets an objective. The objective is to basically affect the revenue that is available to Iran. And so getting the cutback on their purchase of Iranian oil has been part of it. The idea in general is maintain the widest possible coalition of countries that are prepared to be doing things that would hurt the Iranians from an economic standpoint. I think that's the rationale. I can't tell you in every case necessarily it makes sense, but I think that's the rationale.
One last question. Thank you.
Short one. With the exception of South Africa, which had undergone a 10-year on the wrong end of receiving sanctions and regime against its regime, and therefore changed the regime, can either of you give me one example in recent decades when sanctions have actually forced, short of military action, forced a change in a serious policy of any country?
To some degree, unfortunately, you put the caveat in military action. If you can, and as a guy on the ground in Kuwait during it, I didn't think Desert Fox, from its name to its duration, was a particularly glorious military action. But with limited military action and sanctions, we did end Iraq's weapons of mass destruction programs. Alas, we didn't know we'd ended it, and Saddam felt that, it's not a laughing matter, I'm afraid, and Saddam felt that he wasn't going to let people know. So sanctions can work if backed by military force. The thing about Desert Fox is it was not marching on Baghdad. It was a couple of $100 million worth of ordnance deployed over 4 days, and it did the trick because it was coming on a decade of sanctions that had squeezed that country economically. And I think that's the lesson.
The only thing I would add is sanctions can work. They take a long time. That's the problem. In the end, Libya was affected by sanctions. It took a long time. Milosevic was affected by sanctions. It took a long time. The problem is sanctions can have an effect. They do have an effect, but you should never assume that they work in the short run. It takes time for them to work. Well, I think it has to be backed by it, but in the end, Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapon option with sanctions, not with military action. Not with military action. Not with military